March 14, 1944, 4:10 a.m., near Saint-Lô, Normandy. The fog was thick enough to swallow light. Hedgerows stood as pale silhouettes against a gray sky, their outlines smudged by moisture. In a barn that smelled of rust, hay, and old diesel, Corporal Edwin Graves sat at a field table beside a cracked transceiver. The German markings on its panel were still fresh from last week's capture. The air was cold and stale, his breath faint against the steel. He'd been under orders to remain silent until a verified frequency arrived from command. But the convoys he was tracking, 24 Allied fuel trucks hidden under tarpaulins, were already moving into the open. Without a signal confirmation, their route would intersect with an enemy column within the hour. The rule said wait. The ticking in his wristwatch said otherwise. The static in his headset pulsed like distant breathing. Each turn of the dial revealed fragments of voices, German syllables clipped and mechanical. He logged every shift in tone with pencil strokes so tight they tore the paper. His hand shook, not from fear, but from the calculation. Frequency, offset, transmission pattern. The barn's single lamp hummed, its filament quivering in rhythm with the generator outside. The machine's vibration passed through the floorboards, a quiet reminder that power and silence could not coexist for long. Graves adjusted the coil again. Beyond the fog, the faint echo of engines carried through the hedgerows. Diesel throttles, synchronized, patient. The sound of a system ready to move. By regulation, his next act would be treason. To broadcast first meant exposure. To remain silent meant a convoy's destruction. He looked at the barn door, wet wood chained from inside, and understood that his world had narrowed to one frequency band. A single pulse of sound could determine whether the night ended in ignition or invisibility. He opened the transmitter log, wiped his hand on his sleeve, and pressed the send key. The tone went out, a short burst, then another. The static folded over it like snow. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then a return ping, sharp, deliberate, confirming the German channel was live. Graves's deception held. He spoke in short, confident German, imitating the clipped rhythm he'd studied from recordings. Unit Delta 4 requesting alignment update. The response arrived almost instantly. A map coordinate, precise and deadly. The enemy believed him. They had just revealed their convoy route. Graves copied the coordinates, tore the page, and stuffed it into the lining of his boot. The moment he switched off the set, the silence returned like a wave collapsing. Outside, a bird shifted on the rafters. The world resumed its waiting. By dawn, the Allied trucks had rerouted south, guided by the numbers Graves had smuggled through an intercepted signal. When German armor advanced, they found empty roads and false tire tracks drawn through mud, the ghost of a vanished column. In the official report, there was no mention of a false transmission, only a single note. Enemy failed to intercept supply route. Cause unknown. Graves was reassigned 2 days later to a maintenance unit. No medal, no citation, just a sealed file. Years later, the barn rotted back into the soil. The field around it was planted with corn, the hedgerows trimmed, the road paved smooth. The frequency he chose that night, 6.178 MHz, remains unlogged in any archive. But every system still depends on one moment of disobedience to stay alive. Would you have broken the silence? Before the war, Edwin Graves was a telegraph engineer in Bristol. His world revolved around signals, lines of copper, measured resistance, the pulse of code across distance. He worked in silence, his hands steady even when the signal wasn't. Faults that baffled others revealed themselves to him not through diagrams, but rhythm. He could sense where a wire had faltered by the way the tone bent, by how the pulse stuttered in its return. He never called it talent. It was a habit of listening until the world aligned again. When the war began, the ministry didn't recruit him for courage. They recruited his precision. He was sent first to Cairo, then to occupied France, placed under the pretense of a German-trained technician, a collaborator in uniform, fluent in radio jargon and industrial repair. He adjusted transmitters for officers who never learned his name. His cover depended not on speech, but silence. To the French resistance, he became known as Le Britannique Muet, the quiet Brit. He ate with them, slept in basements beside field cables, but rarely spoke. His loyalty was not expressed through words. It was expressed through the steady hum of a circuit made whole. In Bristol, before the bombs, his evenings ended with the tram's return to the depot. The metallic brakes sang in long, even notes. He'd walk home counting their rhythm, every squeal and spark aligning like punctuation marks in code. That memory never left him. In Normandy, surrounded by engines and frost, it returned again. The rhythm of a living system, trams, wires, men, each dependent on the other's timing. By 1944, his hands had grown rough from rewiring broken sets in barns and ruined factories. He carried no weapon. His uniform bore no rank. The only constant weight was the field transceiver's metal casing against his back. Every unit he joined was told the same thing. He listens before he speaks. And so he did. To signals, to machines, to the silence between them. In a war that glorified explosions, Graves worked in the opposite direction. He created absence. Absence of interference, of static, of discovery. That morning near St. Lo, when the frequency hissed to life, it wasn't bravery that steadied him. It was familiarity. The pattern of tone and static matched a dozen faults he'd fixed before. His breathing aligned with the rhythm. His hands, though cold, moved as they had in Bristol. Slight pressure on the dial, slow correction of a stuttered tone. For him, the act of deception was mechanical, not moral. Systems existed to function. His only rule, the signal must be clean. Industrial lines of war mirrored the telegraph networks he once serviced. Vast, impersonal, dependable. Oil drums, supply trucks, relay posts, all parts of the same circuit. Men like Graves were its resistors, balancing the current so nothing burned too hot. Machines were not instruments of destruction to him. They were instruments of order, and when order trembled, he repaired it, quietly, methodically, without asking what side it served, only that it worked. By dawn, as his forged transmission rippled through enemy bands, he did not feel triumph. He listened for confirmation, one clean tone returning through the static. And when it came, he exhaled once and closed the switch. For a man who measured worth in signal clarity, that tone was enough. History would later forget his name, as it forgets most who speak in code. But without his rhythm, the convoys would not have moved. The line between silence and disaster is often drawn by one who listens instead of speaks. Would you have trusted sound over orders? The Allied intelligence network in occupied France was less an army than a living circuit. Wires, couriers, timetables, and code words woven through the daily machinery of occupation. From the outside, it looked like routine commerce, loaves of bread with hollow cores, bicycles with coiled transmitters hidden in the frames, crates of wine filled not with bottles, but batteries. Each relay point existed to keep the current of information flowing. No noise, no delay. A single fault, a courier late, a code misheard, a message transmitted twice, could short the entire system. By March 1944, that circuit pulsed toward one purpose: the coming invasion. The Allied timetable depended on invisible precision. Bridges counted by footsteps, troop movements measured by signal intervals. Graves was not a soldier within that web, but its conductor. His task in St. Lo was narrow and exact: determine whether the German 352nd Infantry Division had shifted south. Their relocation would alter the projected supply route meant to feed the D-Day buildup along the western flank. If the division moved undetected, fuel convoys could drive straight into a kill zone before the landings even began. Each hour carried its own rhythm. Couriers moved under curfew. The resistance timed their deliveries to passing freight trains, so footsteps merged with wheel clatter. Messages moved as if through veins, steady, unseen, vital. The radio silence binding them all was not superstition. It was structure. Within that structure, Graves was a single node. His transceiver's pulse had to match a pattern spread across continents. London's cipher desks, field stations in Brittany, command bunkers under chalk cliffs. One frequency out of phase could create false movement on a map, misplace an entire division, or summon bombers to the wrong grid. In the barn at St. Lo, the web narrowed to him. The static between bursts of coded tone wasn't empty. It was filled with waiting. Every agent, every relay point, paused inside that silence. A collective breath before the next signal resumed. War, to Graves, was not chaos, but timing. The ticking of watches, the alignment of train schedules, the hum of generators before dawn. It was a form of engineering, brutal in consequence, mechanical in nature. Elsewhere that same night, in a cellar near Caen, a courier slid a folded strip of paper into a jar of jam bound for Paris. In a town square, a resistance boy pedaled with a message hidden under his seat spring. A priest in Bayeux adjusted the church's clock forward by 3 minutes, a subtle cue for synchronization. None of them knew the others existed, yet the system held. Invisible, precise. When Graves broke silence to mimic the German transmission, he wasn't defying command. He was protecting rhythm. One disruption avoided another. His message would realign the system, redirect the flow before the current burned through the wrong line. The moment his falsified signal merged into enemy traffic, the circuit continued without pause. On Allied maps, the 352nd Division's position shifted north, sparing the corridor that would, weeks later, carry convoys toward the beaches. No one in the chain knew his name. His signal was recorded as unverified field source. The machinery moved on. That was its strength and its blindness. Systems built to survive needed men like Graves, willing to vanish into the static once their part was done. By May, Allied logistics officers calculated their timetables again. Fuel convoys, landing craft, ammunition trains, all synchronized down to the minute. None of them traced their safety to one voice in a fogged barn months earlier. But history often runs on silent currents, on decisions no one records. Every machine demands maintenance. Every system depends on a single point that cannot fail. By 5:00 a.m., the air inside the barn had turned metallic and cold. Moisture condensed on the steel casing of the field receiver, beading along its edges, running down into the cracks of the wooden table. Each drop landed with a slow rhythm, merging with the faint hiss of static from the transceiver. Graves sat still, headset pressed to one ear, the other listening to the quiet world beyond the walls, a world where nothing moved too quickly. The ground outside had hardened overnight. Frost clung to the grass, dull and unmoving in the half-light. Through the static, Morse pulsed faintly, clipped, precise, German. Patrol units checking their sector integrity, routine transmissions passing along the network. He recorded each tone by instinct, noting the pause between letters, the weight of silence after each word. Then, buried under the ordinary chatter, came an echo. Distorted, delayed, his own signal from earlier, warped and faint. He froze. The frequency was bouncing back. Someone, somewhere, was listening. The barn's timbers creaked as the fog outside thickened. It was the kind of sound that could be mistaken for breathing. Graves glanced once toward the door, then returned to his dials. He adjusted the tuning half a degree lower. Steady hand, slow movement. The metal knob felt slick beneath his thumb. Through the headphones came another trace. A repeated set of coordinates. German voice transmission, clipped mid-sentence. Then silence. The air inside the barn seemed to contract. He logged the numbers mechanically, then folded the paper, slipping it beneath the radio base. His pulse matched the static. Moments later, distant trucks began to move. Not on the main road, but across the open fields north of the hedgerow. Their engines carried differently through the fog, heavier, slower, using low gear. It wasn't transport routine. It was search pattern movement. He knew the sound. A line of vehicles advancing without headlights, changing lanes by signal, not by sight. The frequency on his receiver flickered again, then went dead. He waited. Nothing. Graves leaned forward, pressing the headphone tighter. The receiver hummed under strain, static turning granular. For a moment, it felt like the entire airfield's sound had compressed into one narrow line of noise. He switched the frequency again. One tick upward, a blank band. Another half degree, still nothing. Only the faint internal hum of the equipment. Then, without warning, a soft, human breath came through the line. Not words, just a single inhalation. The kind that happens when someone realizes they are no longer alone. He removed the headset and sat still. The barn walls were thick, the air heavy with rot and hay dust. He could hear his heartbeat against the wood. Outside, the sound of engines faded east toward the tree line. The fog rolled low again, swallowing their tracks. For a long time, the only movement came from the condensation sliding off the receiver's edge. The clock on the shelf marked 5:47. According to regulation, his next authorized contact was 13 minutes away. The standard procedure was clear. Remain silent. Monitor. Confirm pattern repetition at 600 hours. But the silence now had its own rhythm, unnaturally precise. 3 minutes of nothing, then a soft rise of static, then stillness again. It was too structured to be random. It felt engineered, like a pulse waiting to stop. Graves rubbed his palms on his tunic. The moisture left dark streaks against the fabric. The line stayed dead. Every instinct told him to wait. But his work had never been about obedience. It was about function. Circuits that failed to adjust burned out. And in the machinery of war, failure meant fire, not reprimand. He turned the dial again, slowly, carefully. One last correction into the void. Somewhere out in the fog, a relay key clicked twice in answer. The system was still alive. But so was whatever else had been listening. Every network has its static, the kind that warns before words arrive. The codebook was clear. No initiative without clearance. Every operator knew it by heart. The first line of every field manual, printed in block letters, underlined twice. Graves had carried that rule through 3 stations and 2 fronts, from Bristol workshops to North African outposts, until it had become a kind of scripture. Unbreakable. Absolute. Orders before instinct, system before self. Yet war corrodes patience faster than it consumes fuel. And in the damp silence of that barn near St. Lo, rules began to sound less like order and more like delay. The receiver glowed with faint green light, its dial markings blurred by condensation. Graves leaned closer, studying the static pattern. What had begun as background noise now pulsed in sequence, a pattern of movement, too consistent to be random. The German transmitters were repositioning. The pitch of their tone carried a faint distortion, a telltale sign of distance shifting. To an untrained ear, it was nothing. To Graves, it meant their field units were moving south. That single observation, if confirmed, would rewrite the Allied supply timetable. But confirmation required a signal. His signal, sent without authorization. He wiped his palms on his tunic, leaving a faint dark trace where the fabric had absorbed the sweat. The air smelled of diesel and mold, faintly metallic from the battery's slow leak. He reached for the key, then stopped. The words of his instructor in Bristol came back, as calm and mechanical as the ticking of a clock. Never speak first. Never let your signal reveal you. The instruction had saved hundreds of operators from triangulation. It had also condemned others to silence, waiting for orders that never came. Outside, frost thickened on the window pane. A truck engine groaned in the fog, distant but deliberate. He could picture it. A convoy turning along an unmarked road, unaware that their path was already compromised. Graves looked again at the glowing dials. The machinery seemed alive, breathing through its faint hum. The line between obedience and paralysis narrowed to a single decision. He could wait for the scheduled contact at SO600, or he could break the code. He traced a finger across the Morse key, feeling the cold brass under his skin. The rule said silence preserved the system, but silence was also what broke it. For every convoy that moved without warning, for every unit left unalerted, the cost of obedience compounded. Systems are built on trust, but they survive on correction, and no circuit ever stayed functional without resistance. The generator outside coughed once, then steadied. A thin wisp of exhaust seeped beneath the door. Graves exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Then he spoke, not to anyone, but to the machine. 3 meaningless syllables, improvised, quiet. The receiver clicked once, transmitting the sound into the fog. It lasted less than a second. Yet in that second, everything that had held him in stillness broke. The transmission carried across the hedgerows, merging with the enemy's frequency. He waited. The static trembled, then replied, faint, distant, but real. A German operator answered with acknowledgement protocol. The illusion was complete. Graves's false signal had passed as authentic. The confirmation he needed arrived encoded within it. The enemy's movement had indeed begun southward. He marked it down, tore the slip from his logbook, and sealed it into a waterproof envelope. When it was done, he sat back. The air was colder now. The light of the receiver dimmed with the battery's fatigue. He had broken the one rule designed to preserve him, yet in doing so, preserved the system it served. There would be no commendation, no mention in reports. The war's machinery would turn on, blind to the hand that had kept it aligned. Rules make systems predictable, but men make them work. The transmission lasted 3 seconds, a soft pulse, 3 syllables, 1 false call sign. The tone carried clean through the fog. Steady, disciplined, artificial. Then silence. The static filled the gap, rough and uneven, like air passing through dust. Graves sat motionless, headset pressed against one ear, hand still on the key. He waited. Seconds stretched, uncounted. Then 2 clicks. Pause, 4 more. He wrote them down without hesitation, marking the gaps between each return click. To an ordinary listener, it was meaningless, stray interference, routine static. But to Graves, trained in rhythm and wire, it was precision. The spacing between the clicks was wrong, slightly wider, a delay of half a second. The kind that came not from hesitation, but distance, 20 kilometers farther east than where the transmitter should have been. A simple error of habit from the German operator. Spacing that exposed the truth. Their signal truck had already moved. The 352nd Division was no longer centered in St. Lo. It was on the road, repositioning south toward the Allied corridor. Graves let the numbers settle on the page, tracing each space with his pencil. The world outside stayed still. The barn's air was cold enough that his breath fogged the paper. The faintest hum of diesel drifted through the walls. One of the resistance trucks idling beyond the hedgerow, waiting for word that would never officially exist. He checked the codebook one last time. Procedure required confirmation by higher command. That could take hours, maybe longer. The field lines were too fragile for repetition. One more transmission might burn the deception he had built. He folded the paper, tore the top edge, and slipped it inside his jacket. His duty, by every manual, ended there. But in practice, his silence now carried more weight than any spoken order. Through the transceiver, the static began to fade, replaced by the low hum of a steady carrier wave. Somewhere, the German operator had left his key down, a brief mistake that bled a trace tone across the line. Graves listened to it quietly. Every system had its rhythm. Every rhythm carried the mark of its maker. The pitch told him the transmitter used a short whip antenna, the kind mounted on mobile vehicles. That confirmed it. Relocation complete. He didn't need maps or scouts. The sound alone drew the movement. Outside, the first light of dawn began to press through the fog. The frost on the grass turned to thin threads of steam. In the distance, a rooster called once, then fell silent. Graves leaned back, the headset still over his ear, and let the static fade into background hum. The job was done. No explosion, no gunfire, just a quiet correction inside the system. By the time London decrypted the coordinates, the invasion timetable had already shifted. Fuel convoys rerouted inland, skirting the German realignment by less than half a mile. A corridor of trucks rolled uninterrupted. The adjustment would never be credited to any one man. On paper, the intelligence self-corrected. In truth, it corrected because one engineer broke silence when the machine required sound. Graves noted the time, 5:58 a.m., and powered down the transmitter. The generator outside gave a low sigh as it stopped, its metal casing ticking as it cooled. The fog thinned. The barn, once filled with signal and tension, fell still again. For 3 seconds of defiance, the system held its breath and survived. The war moved forward as if it had never depended on one man in a barn. Every frequency carries a choice. Every choice leaves static behind. Would you have pressed the key? By mid-morning, the fog had thinned to a dull gray mist that clung to the hedgerows. Inside the barn, Graves worked in silence. The mission log, the coded slips, the torn page with coordinates, all of it went into the stove. The flame burned unevenly at first, blue at the base, orange along the edges where oil residue caught. He watched until the paper curled, turned black, and broke into drifting fragments that vanished through the roof cracks. The transceiver followed next. He dismantled it piece by piece. Coils, dials, tubes, separating metal from casing until nothing resembled a working circuit. The barn smelled of heated dust and smoke. Miles away, the system he had quietly altered began to move. At 09:10 hours, Allied reconnaissance patrols received an updated intercept order. A new grid coordinate, only a few degrees of latitude corrected, redirected their sweep pattern. It was a minor adjustment, buried inside a string of routine transmissions, but its effect was immediate. The lead squadron, already forming over the channel, altered its course south by 11 miles. Minutes later, high above the countryside near Coutances, they spotted a convoy of German trucks halted in the open, caught mid-relocation, engines exposed, camouflage nets still folded. The bombers did not hesitate. The strike came fast, clinical, and final. Below, the German 352nd Division's forward communications convoy was erased before it could dig in. The same convoy whose spacing delay Graves had traced in static only hours earlier. The division's signals line collapsed before dawn had fully cleared. To the command staff, it appeared as coincidence, enemy miscalculation, fog confusion, or simple bad timing. But the record of that morning's frequency shift existed only in one place, a charred entry on a field notebook now turned to ash. Graves didn't know the outcome then. By noon, his receiver was gone, his uniform jacket folded into a satchel, and the barn's ashes scattered under a thin layer of straw. He sat outside on a fence rail, the air warmer now, hands wrapped around a tin mug that had long since gone cold. A resistance courier arrived on a bicycle just after midday. A boy no older than 17, mud splattered to his knees. He handed Graves a folded slip of paper, unmarked, unsealed. The message was 6 words. The field cleared itself. Good line, that was all. No coordinates, no signature, no rank. Graves read it once, then tore it in half, and let the pieces drift into the grass. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, as though confirming a detail already known. In the logbook that survived, his final notation for March 14th read only 3 words: "Line adjusted, complete." By afternoon, he was on the road north, walking toward another post, another borrowed transmitter, another silence waiting to be broken. Behind him, the war machine continued to turn. Bombers refueled, convoys reloaded, signals redirected through safer channels. No mention was ever made of the false radio check that saved them. In the official dispatches, the adjustment appeared as a standard correction: field operator uncredited. War depends on millions of such adjustments: the minor, the unseen, the silent. Graves would never know how many men lived because he pressed a key once against regulation. He had broken one rule to preserve a larger system, and in doing so, became invisible to it. At 14 hours, a gust moved through the valley, scattering the last bits of burnt paper from the barn's floor. The war rolled forward, indifferent, efficient, alive. Some victories are never recorded, only absorbed by the system that demanded their secrecy. Would you have burned the evidence? Section 8. Authority. Reckoning. Silence as a statement. Weeks passed before anyone noticed the anomaly. The St. Lo relay records were stacked among hundreds of after-action logs, their pages marked with pencil smudges and damp fingerprints. When headquarters finally reviewed the signal trace, one entry stood out: a 3-second transmission with no authorization code, logged by Corporal Edwin Graves. The notation was simple: line adjusted. That phrase should not have existed. Under regulation, every transmission required clearance, witness, and confirmation. Graves's file contained none of those. A review board assembled in a temporary office near Portsmouth. 3 officers, a communications analyst, and a pile of intercepted frequencies stacked like bricks. The evidence was technical, impersonal. The unauthorized transmission aligned perfectly with the window of the German convoy's destruction near Coutances. To the staff, it was coincidence. The war was full of them. The analyst, a young lieutenant, pointed out the anomaly in signal delay, the same delay that had revealed the enemy's relocation. His superior closed the folder, marking it as static interference, non-reproducible. That phrase would be copied into the official report and buried under a layer of administrative neutrality. By May of that year, the invasion front had stabilized, and the Allied supply corridors were running at full capacity. Few remembered that one German division near Coutances had failed to deploy in time. In the network of war, memory fades at the same speed as transmission. Graves continued to listen. Ships came and went, their signals rising and falling through static like breath. The silence between them was no longer emptiness. It was proof. The system still alive, still moving, still intact. He never spoke of the false transmission again. The line had adjusted. The war had continued. Sometimes victory sounds like static. Sometimes silence is the only signal left. Would you have kept the silence working? After the war, Edwin Graves returned to the world he had left. Not to medals or ceremony, but to the hum of switchboards and the scent of solder. Britain was rebuilding. Telegraph lines were being reconnected, cables laid across old bomb craters, transmitters rewired to carry peace instead of orders. Inside a Bristol exchange office, Graves sat at a desk lined with new machines, their panels brighter, smoother, faster. The world had learned to speak again, louder and clearer than before. Yet in that noise, his war vanished. The fake radio check that had once altered an entire invasion timetable now existed only as a 3-second gap in an archive no one would ever reopen. He never told anyone what happened in Normandy. The act had no name, no record, no proof. In official history, it became static, a fault dismissed by engineers and analysts who measured war only through tonnage and movement. But among the operators who had lived through the silence of occupied Europe, there was an unspoken understanding. The machines might have carried the war, but the men had kept them alive. Graves's life returned to routine. Each morning, he walked to work past rows of factories where conveyor belts carried the rhythm of the new age. Steel pressing steel, circuits humming, voices transmitted without pause. He found comfort in that order. He repaired lines, logged frequencies, replaced coils. To others, it was a job. To him, it was maintenance of a larger truth. Systems survive because someone, somewhere, refuses to let them fail. By the late 1950s, automation replaced much of what he once did by instinct. Machines now listened to other machines. The precision he had lived by was perfected beyond human touch. Yet sometimes, when the circuits stuttered or the signal wavered, Graves would pause. He would hear the old static again. Faint, persistent, somewhere between frequencies. The same pulse that had once betrayed an enemy convoy through a barn wall of frost and hay. It had not faded. It had only moved. The barn in Normandy no longer stood. The wood rotted. The roof collapsed. Its foundations were plowed under and turned to farmland. But buried deep beneath that soil, fragments of rusted wire still ran through the earth. Relics of a moment when instinct overrode command. Rainwater passed through them each year, carrying traces of metal downstream, back toward the channel. The signal, in its way, continued to move. For those who study the war's logistics, the story never appears in reports. They chart tonnage, fuel ratios, convoy efficiencies, the measurable parts of a victory. But the truth remains quieter. Precision built the system. Instinct kept it from breaking. Every wire, every valve, every frequency in that war was tuned by human hands that understood both discipline and defiance. Graves was one of them. In the end, he believed silence was not the absence of communication, but its highest form. The proof that a line could hold, that a system could endure without constant correction. He spent his final years listening to radio static late at night, content with the hum that connected him to a world once held together by sound and decision. The war ended. The system lived, and somewhere across the frequency spectrum, the ghost of that signal still lingers, a trace of human judgment inside a perfect machine. Would you have sent the signal, or trusted the silence to speak for you?